I am honored to be here at the Fulbright University of Vietnam among this enthusiastic and creative group, and I look forward to sharing my new work and to learn from you all. Okay. Most viewers of photography are drawn to attention-grabbing images, but I am captivated by the less visible. I seek out photographs of ordinary events and lives, those brushed to the edges of history or erased from records. I'm intrigued by lost, disappeared, or never made images, and by stories of photographic encounters that resonate emotionally despite loss. I value the potential of these shared experiences to form connections across time and space, despite separations and estrangements. The qualities that make some images overlooked or disregarded, their repetitiveness, their ordinariness, their strangeness, or their uncanniness, are what fascinate me. This fascination with overlooked and erased images led me to write Warring Visions, Photography in Vietnam, where I explore an alternative visual history of the war by focusing not on the famous, but the often forgotten, the work of Vietnamese photographers whose stories have been sidelined. He's no longer sidelined, by the way. I wrote it out of frustration that my experiences didn't align with these famous images, which are often preoccupied with American experiences while disregarding that of others. My book centers on Vietnamese photographers' crucial yet overlooked contributions to the war's memory, offering an alternative account to the iconic photographs that shaped my childhood. So while traditional images of war shaped public memory, today's visual landscape is undergoing dramatic transformation thanks to the digital revolution. This shift presents both new opportunities and unsettling challenges in how we remember historical events. The visual field is more crowded than ever. The digital revolution has brought us smartphones and social media, which have made it easy to snap and circulate images swiftly, abundantly, instantaneously, and endlessly. At the same time, the rise of generative AI and the use of deepfake and shallow fake technologies for disinformation are undermining the credibility of photographs and of historical records. These developments fundamentally transform how we remember and how we shape history. They also deeply unsettle critical assumptions that were widely accepted when I began teaching a few decades ago, and which I sought to challenge in my book. These days, when I show the most iconic of Vietnam War photographs, an anguished child gravely wounded by a napalm attack, a protesting monk engulfed in flames, a summary execution on a busy Saigon street. Only a few students, in Toronto, by the way, raise their hands in tentative recognition. For after all, I teach far away, in a place known as a haven for US draft dodgers and worlds apart from the traumas that Americans experienced. If I, who have no clear, direct memories of the war, feel a certain distance from it, then my younger students, including the students who are here today, are even further removed. In an age so saturated with images that iconic photographs may have lost their cultural weight, I wondered what kind of images might resonate today. As we approach the 50th anniversary of reunification, I find myself wondering how, if at all, the post-war generation engages with photographs from this pivotal moment. This talk examines two photographic projects, one American and the other Vietnamese, that use digital tools to preserve and revive memories of the war, an increasingly urgent task as veterans and their immediate descendants age. Both projects in the US and Vietnam restore and enhance old photographs of dead combatants, sometimes even animating them to engage younger generations unfamiliar with conflict. A key part of this story unfolds at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Designed by architect Maya Lin and dedicated in 1982, its V-shaped granite wall bears the names of over 58,000 American soldiers lost in the war. Visitors often leave photographs as tributes, highlighting the photography's role in transforming everyday images into powerful symbols of remembrance. This was never originally a photographic project, but in the early 2000s, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund launched the Wall of Faces. It's a digital project to collect photographs of every service member named on the memorial, and their motto is putting a face to every name. The initiative gained momentum in 2009 through the Faces Never Forgotten campaign, which encouraged public participation in gathering images. However, its reliance on volunteer-submitted photographs has sparked debates over authenticity and restoration. The project guidelines insist on kind of an original photograph, and they discourage, in fact, explicitly state that no digital enhancements would be accepted in the photographs that are contributed. However, many images have been, I believe, altered, as you can see here. Critics argue that modifying historical photographs distorts memory and compromises archival integrity, an especially strong concern in Western preservation practices. Yet some volunteers who have painstakingly sourced images from obituaries and yearbooks defend the enhancements for clarity and recognition. This tension, for example, photographs, like, are these even photographs, right? This tension reflects broader anxieties about AI's role in historical preservation, particularly given racial inequities in older photographic technologies that were designed to flatter lighter skin tones. So there's a problem with the collection of faces of African-American soldiers because the camera technologies in the earlier parts of the 20th centuries were meant to flatter lighter skin tones. Despite concerns, many families who have contributed images prioritize legibility over purity, embracing restoration. The evolving role of photography at memorials like the Wall underscores how visual media shapes collective memory. Similar digital memorialization efforts are emerging beyond the US, including in Vietnam, where the restorations of dedicated, youthful volunteers revive photographs of revolutionary martyrs. And this is where I now turn. On July 2023, 50 years after the Paris Peace Accords ended the war with the withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam, a group of young men and women set forth bearing gifts wrapped in the bright colors of the nation's flag. They were on their way to deliver portraits of socialist heroes, which they had restored and colorized as members of the Team Lee project. Team Lee is a volunteer group in Vietnam, one of many, who are dedicated to restoring and colorizing photos of revolutionary martyrs, let's say. They and similar groups, such as Skyline, share their work on a Facebook page. You can sort of see. Oh, why is this? Where the families of these martyrs request help to rescue damaged photos of loved ones. After restoration, the volunteers frame and wrap the photos in the nation's crimson colors, presenting them to families in emotional ceremonies often recorded and shared online. These videos highlight the transformation from blemished vintage images to bright, vibrant, youthful portraits, symbolizing a visual reunion with the past. Through the volunteers' digital alterations, the men and women who gave their lives to the revolution are restored to their still grieving families and to the nation. The glow of youth gleaming on the martyrs' cheeks, their ardor as fervent as it once had been. The transformation is dramatized. You're seeing this. Against the backdrop of sparks that burst into revolutionary flames. I think it's beautiful. Through this photographic encounter, the young volunteers can be seen as bridging the gap between past and present, making the significance of martyr photos resonate with deep poignancy in the post-revolutionary era, especially as war veterans and their immediate survivors age and pass away. What is striking to me about this initiative is that although restored images are intended to correct the originals, for Team Lee and similar volunteer photo restoration groups, improvement does not seem to strive towards achieving likeness that one might expect to be kind of the convention of portraiture. Supposedly, assumed to be a defining feature of photographic portraits. Instead, there is a distinctively stylized quality, and one so unsettling that it elicits that uncomfortable laughter that we just heard. There's this distinctively stylized quality to the images restored by the volunteers, which all display a deeply saturated olive green and rich scarlet, so blazingly vibrant they seem unreal. The embellishments in the restored and colorized martyr portraits evoke the deliberately stylized approach seen in illustrated magazines like Vietnam Pictorial. As I've argued elsewhere, the colorized images in these publications aim less to offer a realistic portrayal of the war at the time and more to project an idealized vision of a socialized utopia yet to come. This undisguised contrivance in aesthetic choices also mirrors the restoration styles characteristic of Vietnam's Doi Mai era, the period of economic and social revolution that began in 1986. Anthropologist Nina Hien aptly describes this as a beauty regime where visual enhancements play a crucial role in shaping and promoting the cultural discourse of renovation of time. And yet there is an uncanny quality to these images. I find it unsettling to gaze upon these martyrs who, instead of remaining still, look back at us. In the old black and white photographs, the eyes of the subjects are indistinct, sealed shut, or sealed tight by the limitations of the ink and the wear of time. But then in the supposedly corrected photographs, the men and women's and children's eyes are bright and wide open. And they seem to beckon. I'm going to show you this video. The video showcasing the transformation at a final flourish. Here. AI animates the martyrs, making them blink as though awakening, while the corners of their eyes crease into a slight smile, perhaps in recognition of the viewer's regard. Perhaps this quality of uncanniness derives from the expectation that images are supposed to be fixed in place. They may be moving in their emotional impact, but they are not supposed to move. To disturb historical objects, even in the name of improvement, deviates from one of the core principles of historical preservation, returning objects to their original condition. The depth and scale of the volunteers' enhancements exceed what traditional photo conservationists would endorse and might be seen to risk undermining the historical integrity of images. However, the volunteers' visual manipulations in the name of restoration may well be placed and understood within the longer history of embellishment I traced in my earlier work. But even so, the volunteers' visual manipulations are disquieting in the current context of moral panic surrounding AI-generated images and the threat they pose for spreading disinformation. So for context, in April 2021, Vice magazine faced global backlash for a photo restoration and colorization project. The project involved altering images from the infamous S21 Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Matt Lowry, an Irish photographer, added smiles to the faces of the victims from the Khmer Rouge genocide. I'm not going to show what he did. You can look it up yourself. This controversial experiment was met with condemnation from the National Cambodia Heritage Museum and the Killing Fields Memorial, which emphasized that such alterations distort history and perpetuate trauma. The controversy laid bare the ethical boundaries of manipulating historical images to correct images in such a way to make victims of torture and genocide smile, to supposedly humanize them, is to distort history. While I'm not suggesting that the Vietnamese volunteers' work is comparable to the unethical alteration of the S21 images, I highlight this case to consider the broader context of current practices of visual restoration. In the current era, the correction, colorization, and animation of vintage images have become pervasive practices that have driven what anthropologist Dan Ngo has aptly described as a necropolitical economy that has built digital environments, giving rise to death tech and so-called nanotechnology. As media studies critics have observed, these digital environments mobilize technological features to, quote, offer a multitude of ways for users to remember or even interact with the dead. close quote, giving rise to concerns about the ethics of handling these so-called digital remains. What do the dead want? Who may speak on behalf of the dead? Who may protect the rights of images of the dead? So as noted earlier, restorationists take it upon themselves to correct vintage photographs and share their results of works on platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and many others. They respond to public appeals to repair torn, creased, and wrinkled family photos, including ordinary images of loved ones who served tours of duty in the American War in Vietnam. Beyond these crowdsourcing initiatives, there are larger projects that have attracted widespread praise. One notable example is the Japan-based Rebooting Memories project, which leverages AI to colorize vintage images of Hiroshima, and supposedly to revive the memory for generations that are forgetting the importance of this tragic event. Amateur genealogists have further embraced AI for the ease with which the departed can be resurrected and the promise of an immersive experience whereby viewers can touch the past. When the popular MyHeritage website launched its deep nostalgia software, you can link to the site later on, adapted from the live portrait feature developed by DID, a platform for AI-generated digital video creation. You can sort of see what happens here. There was an overwhelmingly positive response. When the Deep Nostalgia app first launched in 2021, it quickly catapulted to the most downloaded free app in the US and UK, making it even more popular than TikTok. The promotional copy on DID's website boasts that over, quote, 26 million faces have been animated in just a few days at a rate of thousands per hour. A now recognizable feature of this animation is slight facial movement, specifically the blink of the eye and smile in looped videos. The latter being the projection of positive affect that was so profane in the case of the manipulated S21 mugshots. Media critics assert that these elements of animation, at least in the case of Deep Nostalgia, are directed by the algorithm and by the programmers and facial movements of datafied bodies. That is, by the information that is encoded through deep learning of countless photographs. Many of them readily available online, but together form the image data sets that power this political economy built on a layered process of identifying patterns in data. What results, however, is a discernible homogeneity in animations. Animation after animation features the same gestures, the blink and the smile. The blink in AI-generated portraits is more than a technical flourish. It is supposedly an unconscious gesture that can be seen to convey recognition, collapsing the distance between past and present. In that fleeting motion, the image appears to acknowledge the viewer, unsettling the stillness we expect from historical photographs. Yet when replicated across thousands of restored portraits, the effect risks becoming mechanical rather than spontaneous, a programmed reflex rather than an intimate gesture. This tension between presence and fabrication extends the AI-generated smile. Long a hallmark of portraiture, the smile in the history of visual culture is less a spontaneous expression than a cultivated convention. How many of you have tried to pose for a photograph, and regardless of how you feel, hungry, sad, whatever, just smile. That's what I mean by a cultivated convention. Say cheese, right? In early photography, technical constraints favored solemnity. As cameras evolved, the smile emerged as an expression of optimism. More than capturing a moment, it projected an aspirational ideal, the feeling you're supposed to feel, regardless of how you currently feel, shaping how subjects wish to be seen and remembered. AI-generated smiles then continue this tradition, but amplify its effects. No longer an individual gesture, the AI-driven smile, blinking, tilting, endlessly replicated, functions as an algorithmic cue for engagement. It signals warmth and familiarity, yet its ubiquity risks reducing it to an engineered reflex, transforming the smile from an expression of joy into a persistent, even coercive demand for emotional response. This homogenizing tendency is evident in volunteer-driven restoration work in Vietnam as well. While it remains unclear whether these volunteers use Deep Nostalgia software, they have only confirmed to me their use of Photoshop, which many of you already know, has been integrating AI into its tools for over a decade and significantly expanded its generative capabilities in 2023. Regardless of what actually they're using, the results evoke a similar digitally mediated expressiveness. The smiles and softened features rendered by algorithmic processes create a peculiar continuity across restored martyr portraits, blurring individual distinctions alongside the uniform colors. The restored AI animated portraits accord with what critics have described as red aesthetics, which are the distinctive hallmarks of socialist visual culture. Yet their work is not merely about photographic restoration. It is guided by distinct visual conventions and cultural imperatives rooted in Vietnamese traditions of memorialization. The portraits that the volunteers restore are not ordinary images, but Yi An, funerary portraits imbued with profound cultural and spiritual significance. These portraits play a central role in private commemorations or memorial practices, while those depicting martyrs hold additional weight in state commemorations, serving to honor revolutionary heroes. In Vietnam, funerary portraits are not simply representations of the deceased, but vital conduits through which the spiritual presence of the departed remains connected to their descendants, sustained by ongoing familial and social rites. Art historian Ji-Hae Kim, in her study of funerary portraits in Asia, observes that these images are deeply intertwined with remembrance rites tied to ancestor worship across East and Southeast Asia. In these traditions, photographs serve as vessels for the spirit or home of the deceased during funerary observances. Unlike in Western traditions, where photography is seen as memento mori, a reminder of absence and death, these portraits signify the ongoing presence of the departed. They bridge the physical and spiritual realms, sustaining relationships between the living and the dead through commemoration practices. This nuanced role challenges the Western view of photography as merely a static image of the past. While it might seem that any photograph can fulfill this role, certain portraits are more effective than others. The power of these images is not grounded in photographic accuracy or likeness alone. Central to their function is the concept of transmission of spirit or essence, Dring Tan. In a conversation with me, one of the volunteers remarks that, quote, "As young people, we used to think very rationally and logically, but there are some instances when the photo restorations have been returned to the family, and I can feel the actual spirits being transmitted back to the family members. It moved me when he sees people who have been lost or wandering being transmitted back to the family members. I can even sometimes feel the presence there." This volunteer adds that he felt he had been granted more luck, more help by doing this, and a sense of reciprocity, noting that in such moments, though hard to pinpoint exactly when, he felt a gust of wind blowing through, and he knows it's a spirit coming back. The portraits restored by the volunteers are then not ordinary images, but funerary portraits that hold special significance. These portraits play a vital role in memorial practices, and in cases where the deceased were martyrs for the socialist cause, serve a symbolic function in commemorations to honor revolutionary heroes. The transmission of spirit is rooted in traditional Vietnamese art, especially painting, where the portrayal of the eyes is critical. Through brush strokes and vivid lines, these representations capture or are meant to capture vitality and essence. In contrast, photographs, being still and static, often fail to convey this spirit. This limitation explains why practices such as painting, colorizing, and enhancing photographs are essential to transforming them into objects capable of conveying spirit across generations. In fact, this cultural context illuminates why martyr portraits are often altered beyond their original form. I guess my larger point is that there is this technological or algorithmic imperative that is framing the way that AI restored images look, but their meaning is not necessarily dictated by the algorithm, but is imbued by the specific spiritual needs of this generation. And that we need to understand these visual conventions within the context of their reception and social use here. Okay. So these modifications, sometimes even incorporating animations such as blinking to emphasize the eyes, may seem uncanny or unsettling to those who view photographs as immutable. But within funerary practices that prioritize transmission of spirit, these techniques serve to underscore kind of an important social function. The blink in AI-altered Vietnamese martyr portraits presents a distinct and provocative shift in the relationship between the viewer and the portrait, particularly within the context of Vietnam's memorial traditions. In the traditional Nhân, or funerary portrait, the eyes are not merely windows to the soul, they are sacred thresholds through which the spirit of the deceased remains connected to the living. These portraits are more than just images, they are vessels that maintain a spiritual link, keeping the deceased watchful and present in the lives of their descendants. Eyes that are open convey vitality, alertness, and spiritual availability. They affirm the ongoing relationality that is core to the veneration of Vietnamese ancestors and the commemoration of martyrs, underscoring that the departed are always near. AI, however, brings a different intervention. Rather than obscuring the eyes, as the passage of time often does in old portraits, AI restorations bring them back into sharp visibility. Many of these historical martyr portraits, weathered and faded, have left the eyes blurred, obscured, or barely discernible. In fact, the photograph is invisible here. The AI restoration then is not an act of intrusion, but a reclamation, returning the visibility and vibrancy of the eyes previously faded into invisibility. When the blink occurs, it might initially seem as a disruption. When you blink, you close your eyes. But it's important to note that the blink in these AI restorations ends with the opening of the eyes. In reality, is an ironic twist that brings us back to the very thing that we may think is slipping away. The eyes now restored are also now fully present. Animations, in other words, do not end with eyes closed, but with them open. The blink becomes a gesture of attention, a call to focus not on the absence of the gaze, but on its vitality and its clarity. This digital intervention, this moment of animation, doesn't just alter the portrait. It redefines how we understand the eyes as both a spiritual and symbolic conduit. The blink, instead of distancing the viewer, promises to deepen the connection, offering an ironic yet powerful reminder of the ever-present connection between the deceased and the living. In this way, AI's manipulation does not disrupt the continuity of these portraits. It renews it, restoring eyes to signify the living presence of the departed, making them visible again, if only for an instant. As for the smile, this expressive gesture in AI-restored images of revolutionary martyrs introduces a layer of irony, a further layer of irony, by shifting the tone of the portrait. As noted earlier, in conventional photographic portraiture, a smile signals human connection, emotions to which viewers aspire. However, when applied to funerary portraits, especially those of martyrs, the smile risks diminishing the solemnity these images traditionally convey. In the context of commemorating revolutionary martyrs, the introduction of a smile complicates the reverence intended for these portraits, softening the gravitas of their sacrifice. Rather than solely representing loss, the smile introduces, however, a sense of reconciliation, suggesting that the departed soldiers might be at peace with their sacrifice, and even acknowledging the efforts of the living to resurrect their revolutionary spirit for the present. This shift is particularly evident when comparing the volunteers' work to the Wall of Faces project in the United States. The Wall of Faces seeks to prioritize photographic integrity, though it often fails to do so, with portraits serving as memento mori, reminders of the fallen to help the living remember. In contrast, the Vietnamese volunteers' restored martyr portraits aim not just to preserve likeness, but to embody the revolutionary spirit. Their project, influenced by the tradition of aesthetic embellishment in socialist and post-socialist Vietnam, emphasizes reverence for the revolutionary legacy over strict visual accuracy. Here, the smile functions as a tool of filial piety, where the focus is on honoring the ancestors' contributions and spirit, rather than maintaining an exact likeness. Through their restoration work, the volunteers symbolically returned lost sons and daughters to their mothers, while in effect positioning themselves as heirs to the nation's revolutionary legacy. Often performed before an ancestral shrine, this process takes on profound meaning. Though born long after the revolution, these volunteers establish a tangible connection to past struggles through their practices. By restoring these images, they do more than preserve history. They actively revive the revolutionary spirit, retroactively claiming a revolutionary role for themselves. Their efforts also transcend traditional ancestral rites, becoming public acts of commemoration broadcast on social media and national television. On the 50th anniversary of the Viet Minh's decisive victory over the French in 1954, Team Lee, for example, presented over 30 restored photographs to the Dinh Bien Phu Museum. Vũ Thị Thuyết Nga, the museum's director, praised the portraits as, quote, so real and lively, especially the eyes, noting how deeply they move the staff. He goes on to praise the volunteers' work in restoring these images, which he believes attests to their heartfelt reverence for the fighter's legacy. Through this work, we can see how the revolutionary spirit symbolically passes from one generation to the next in the digital age. AI-restored animated martyr portraits challenge our very understanding of photography. Are these even photographs? Traditionally, photography has been seen as an indexical medium, its power grounded in a direct physical connection between light, lens, and subject. Yet AI-generated restorations, especially those that introduce movement, like blinks and smiles, undermine this connection. They replace traces of past with algorithmic interpretations, transforming these images from photographs to synthetic media. No longer merely documents, these portraits now simulate presence, reshaping historical absence into a digitally constructed reality. In this way, AI imaging departs from photography's role as evidence, aligning more with computational rendering than just mechanical reproduction. However, it still claims a relationship to photography, not necessarily in its fidelity to the past, but in its ability to evoke recognition, intimacy, nostalgia, and connection. This shift redefines the medium itself, altering what it means to see and remember through a technologically mediated gaze. In the digital age, the past is no longer fixed. It is continually reinterpreted, remediated, and even animated. Restoration increasingly becomes reinvention, with consequences that challenge traditional notions of historical authenticity. While some may argue that digital interventions erase this authenticity, especially in contentious cases like the manipulated S21 photographs, the reality is also more complex. These technologies open new ways to mediate memory and retell history. Digital restoration does more than alter our perception of the past. It reshapes and revitalizes historical narratives, making them resonate not only for those who lived through them, but also for post-war generations distanced from the events. The digital era has fundamentally changed how we remember, preserve, and engage with history. In this evolving landscape, the dead remain a vital part of the living search for meaning, continuity, and identity. As cultural historian Thomas Lacour observes, the dead body matters everywhere and across time, as well as in particular times and particular places. It matters in disparate religions and ideological circumstances. It matters even in the absence of any particular belief about a soul or about how long it might linger around its former body, about what matters or about what might matter or become of it after death. It matters across all sorts of beliefs about an afterlife or a God. It matters in the absence of such beliefs. It matters because the living need the dead more than the dead need the living. It matters because the dead make social worlds. The restoration of martyr portraits and the Wall of Faces initiative showcase the power of images to evoke memory and reimagine the past. These efforts highlight a profound need to maintain connections across generations, even as technological interventions challenge traditional understandings of authenticity. As we navigate the ethical and cultural implications of digital restoration, we are reminded that memory is not static. It is dynamic, shaped by those who preserve, reinterpret, and those who pass it on. Thank you.
So thank you very much. In the keynote address provided by the academic leader of Fulbright University, she mentioned her own enthusiasm for photography. And she mentioned the fact that through photography, you could learn things about other parts of the world that you might not be able to visit, which implies a certain degree of trust, however misplaced, in photography's ability to render truths to us. But in your address, you've turned that on its head, and you've pointed out that new technologies have actually completely stripped us of any ability to trust photography. So my question to you is, has photography actually, after 150 years, run its course? Has the utility of photography to the human race run out? Or are we actually just facing a new technological step forward, and our trust in photography will survive?
Thank you for the question. It's a really important question. It's one that's animated a lot of critics on photography, especially photojournalists. It's not necessarily the question that I'm asking in my talk. I'm interested in the social practices of revolving around images, and I try to do it outside of a moral framework, I guess, and that in that way, it's very consistent with the book that I wrote on warring visions. And so the question I'm asking is not, is photography true or false? Does photography end the war? All of the very important questions that have sustained generations of critics. I am very, first of all, I acknowledge that there's a lot of concern about AI. A lot of concern about how it can be weaponized, how it can serve nefarious purposes, especially when it comes to swaying popular opinion. But it's hard to overlook the fact that it is already a pervasive practice, regardless of whether or not you intend to use it, right? And so I wanted to understand what is the desire for an image might be, regardless of whether or not it's a desire for a photographic image. And so what I take as truthful here is that desire. This desire to transform the image, the desire to remake kind of the martyr portraits and to fulfill the wishes of the family. So if there's a truth to be located, it's in the truth of the desire for the image itself. Whether or not the image is a likeness, I'm arguing too that one of the convention of likeness that we associate with photographic portraiture is not actually necessarily applicable within the context of funerary portraits as it operates in the way that Ji-Hae Kim talks about in East and Southeast Asia, because here it's a desire to kind of capture kind of a home spirit, or and to be able to resonate across generations. I mean, it was remarkable because I've observed this over many years, and I keep going back to museums, and I kept thinking, why are the pictures of the revolutionary mothers, they're remarkable, and the walls are honoring kind of the sacrifices of the women who lost their children to the revolution. And I kept thinking, why do they look so startlingly unreal, right? Like in spectacular colors, painted over. And I kept thinking, well, there's a a quality, and the English words are not correct. I keep thinking excessive, exaggerated, and so on. Let's just call it stylized quality. And in the course of doing this research, I started to understand what was happening there. So it was being done by hand in the old days, manipulating the portraits, painting over it to create this embellished reality or just a style of realism that isn't in accord with the expectations of the Euro-American taste. And I think that what's happening with AI is kind of a reinterpretation of that embellishment through digital enhancement. So I don't mean to skirt your question, it's just that I'm asking a different kinds of research question here, but the one that you have acknowledged is a really important one, is one that other critics in the field are really animated about.
So first of all, thank you for your very insightful presentations. I think I have two questions. So first of all, you talk about the scenes about like death and photography. This is a several questions that are also asking myself a lot. So you talk about like the dead and how the dead cannot tell, and how who have the power to represent them, and even if they're alive, to allow both these alterations and AI touching on their funeral. So I just want to have more of your comments and your opinions about like how can the dead and how is of the power to represent the agencies of the objects. And secondly, I want to ask about like, the comparison you make. I think that what I get about your presentation is that due to cultural difference in the visual culture, there's different interpretations of the AI effects on theories, photography. But also, I noticed that for the cases of Vietnam, you can see that there are a lot of the families of the soldier. I think they're quite old. I think that they're pretty unfamiliar with the AI world of image that we're seeing nowadays, and in comparison with your the opinions of the Cambodians and also the U.S., I think that they are more intellectually and familiar with all these theories and fables and considerations about AIs and ethics. So either the familiarities with AIs and ethics and the moral, even the question to start with, from the standing point of the Vietnamese families and all the making micro-stations. Thank you.
Great questions. I can try to just answer certain parts, and you can, because I know it's very difficult to do simultaneous translation, and it's intellectually quite wearing. So the first part is who owns the dead, who can speak for the dead. And maybe you just flip it around and think about it in the context of Vietnamese people in their relationship to images of their dead. Like, you know, your picture of your grandparent, you actually belong to your grandparent, right? So if that's a poor formulation, what I mean to say is that within legal terms, in the framework that I am aware of, it's the photographer who owns the picture. But what I'm talking about is kind of within social and cultural terms, the family owns the picture of their ancestor, right? And what is different about this case and Matt Lowry's case is that the family is the one that reached out to the volunteers on social media and asked for those images to be restored. So they're asking kind of like as part of their understanding of their relationship to the family and how they wish to remember their ancestor. That's their desire. That is what moves their desire for a photograph. And the difference with the S21 portraits is that Matt Lowry took it upon himself to transform those images without the permission of the family, right? And those are, you know, people who are searching for their family members and who want to remember their family in a particular way. They did not ask him to make their dead family members smile. They did not ask for all of these changes to be made, and he was not authorized to make those changes. And I mean, it's a separate question who authorizes the volunteers to do that, but they wouldn't, my understanding is that they didn't take it upon themselves to just go to any, I guess, to just go and transform any ancestral portrait. And the second part of your question concerns visual literacy and kind of the assumption that Vietnamese people of another generation don't fully understand AI. And like, that resonates with me. My mother can barely understand how to text. Like, you know, it's a joke. That might be true, but I think that we should not overstate kind of the visual literacy of Americans and Canadians or Europeans for that matter. Yeah, you're shaking your head. I think we're still struggling, actually. You know, AI was just announced like 2 years ago. Professors in Canada are like trying to figure out how to teach in the AI world. We don't understand it. And part of the reason that I wrote this paper was like, I'm trying to understand how it's kind of transformed kind of our ways of seeing, how it transforms our ways of working with images. So I absolutely agree that the question of visual literacy is highly relevant here. One of the volunteers told me kind of a funny story about, you know, they're not always working with images of, let's say, from, you know, the American War, but other wars. And they tell this story about how they had altered this image and it looked so real that everyone, the friends of the dead soldier came to visit the family thinking that he had come home and that it was like the recent photograph of him, and they had to explain that actually he was dead, right? And so kind of that story of a sick encounter is a very familiar one actually in the history of technology, right? There's always like some kind of primitive group, community that is so startled by kind of the image that they misrecognize it for the same one. So I find that kind of story repeating itself. It's not to really answer your question about what to do with that earlier generation who may not understand, I guess, what AI is doing. But part of me wonders if it necessarily matters to them that this image is kind of completely transformed, because at least they'll see the whole image. But by the way, I mentioned Jung, who's been working on this kind of final technologies and so on. She's an anthropologist, and she's done field work with people who participated in these projects. And she knows that some of them rejected the restored image because they're like, I don't recognize this person. This is not who this is not the son restored to me. This is a different version of it. So in there's a kind of an unconscious understanding that AI is not producing the reality effect that they were hoping for.
Hi, Professor Thy Phu. Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question more geared towards the use of photography and AI as a social practice, as you said, because when these photographs are, say, stylized and then reanimated, you said that it kind of forges a closer connection with the dead, and that's how people sort of keep that bond with the deceased and their ancestors as well. Do you think there is maybe a desire, or has there been the works that you have taught to, do they wish for it to go even further, that these people are animated in a social setting with their families, eating dinner together, for example? How is that related to, I guess, this bond they want to form with their ancestors?
That would be something to see. I have not encountered an image or like that where people are animated actually having dinner with the relatives, so probably the next generation of AI, no doubt that will happen. What I have seen is composite images where a revolutionary mother would be portrayed next to her dead children. And there they would be visually reunited. So this is a version of what you've seen, but that is not like completely new, right? I talked about it in my first book, Age It, like a long time ago, just like a version of a composite photograph where you connect yourself, you insert yourself into the picture of the past is brought back to the present, and somehow the family is all together again. But no doubt what you were describing, which could be a desire, manifest, could be made real in the next generation of AI.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. So one more question is, so from your presentation, I understand that the relationship between the social practice, ethical consideration, and technologies into one and is separate school. And there's also like a trend in like multiple disciplines that we are headed to an interdiscipline collaborations. But however, I see like there's kind of like, I don't know, like my observation is that seems like the tech world of AI company, they are a technological race. They're trying to develop better and better AI model, while the rest is trying to catch up to understand what is happening. And it always seems like the social science, the humanity researcher are chasing the tech world a bit behind rather than developing together. So my question here is there like in your perspective, is there any kind of like suggestion that, or maybe like possibility where the humanities, where the social scientists, researcher can actually be involved more in the process of developing the AI model, like in the process of data collection, data mining, in the calibrating the parameters, etc.
Come on, that is like an amazing and huge question about the role of the humanities in today's digital age. I myself believe in the humanities. I have to. That's like, it's my background. And like, can you imagine a world where the humanities lead and tech follows? Right. I like to think that would be a more ethical, more critical world. And so if that's kind of your answer, like what kind of model might that look like, rather than one that is about kind of monetizing AI at the expense of our environment, of water resources and so on, and completely shifting kind of the visual landscape to imperil kind of the work of the creative leaders, right? So I would love for that to happen. I happen to be, however, located in the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media of the Humanities, and I have to admit that my colleagues in media studies are extremely skeptical of any of that. They're highly critical to the point where they don't even want to partner with platforms because they maintain kind of the critical. We need to first develop the critical capacity to then understand better how to actualize it. And I think that my work is an attempt to develop kind of a critical language to interpret what these social practices are about. So I'm afraid that with utter humility, I have to say I don't have the answer to this question, simply to affirm what I think is behind that, which is that the world would definitely be a better place if it was humanities-led.